Hey everybody, welcome back to the Women in the Arena podcast. I'm Sarah Scully, your host, and I'm super excited to announce a new series of episodes that we're going to have under our media umbrella titled Sam and Sarah Laced Up and Ready. These episodes are featuring myself and a former guest, Samantha Sliney, who is an attorney, advocate, Air Force officer, military spouse, mom, and many other amazing titles, but most importantly, she's just an amazing human. Together, we'll explore some of the most pressing issues affecting the veteran community with a special focus on issues particularly affecting women. Sam and I had such a great first episode, and I think we realized that there was a necessity to continue these conversations surrounding topics that affect veterans and to do so in a positive way, even when we disagree with what's going on in the world around us. These episodes will drop as our world continues to evolve, whenever there's a moment of change that we feel compelled to unpack. We hope that through open and candid conversations, we'll share our perspectives and experiences aiming to spark thoughtful and respectful dialogue within the community, even when opinions differ. As a reminder, the views expressed in these episodes are solely our own and do not represent the Department of Defense or any external organization. We hope you enjoy. Keep an eye out for future episodes as topics continue to surface and let us know if there's anything that you want to hear about specifically. Enjoy!
All right. Well, I'm so excited to be here this Wednesday evening, recording with you, Sam. So, really excited about this initiative that we're kicking off here underneath the Women in the Arena podcast umbrella. We have discussed, the need and importance of addressing issues and current events that are going on that are affecting the population that we serve, which is the women veteran community and then the veteran community as a whole. And, we've chatted before under our podcast umbrella about the recent or somewhat recent rollbacks of the Women, Peace, and Security initiatives and framework within the Department of Defense. And just enjoyed that so much and enjoyed our conversation and the perspective that you bring as a service member with your law background and just you being such an active and avid advocate for the veteran community. I just wanted us to keep this going. So, really excited that we're here and excited to get into some of the topics that we want to discuss tonight. But would love for you to also share your recent endeavor and what you're doing because there are some updates since we last recorded. So, why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, thanks. Always happy to be here and have a discussion with you, Sarah. So, what's new with me? I have developed a platform. It's called White Lace and Combat Boots. I've rolled out my website and really I call it a platform. A lot of people have asked me like, is it a business? Is it a platform? I call it a platform, but it really encompasses everything that I have been striving to do over the past 5 years with regards to advocacy, both for service members and their families, educating others on how to engage in that advocacy, and then as of late, helping encourage what I call decent discourse in current events. And I borrow that term decent discourse from a Air Force Reserve Colonel named Jay Jackson. He wrote a book called Decent Discourse, and it's a great read. And it's basically encouraging, even if you disagree on a topic, it's so important to actually have a conversation about it. And, at the end of the day, compromise or just agree to disagree. But those conversations and the conversation that you and I are engaging in are just very critical and super important to our republic here in America. So I've rolled out that platform. It's still growing. Underneath the platform is also the books, the children's books that I've published. I'm dipping my toes into consulting with various organizations who may want to bring on someone to discuss how they might make their policies more equitable for families or for veterans, service members, or military spouses. So just really leveraging what I've been able to learn and the experiences that I've had personally for others to be able to leverage, right? Because when you know more, you do better. And I think this podcast and this collaboration between us is also a good example of that. When we're able to have these discussions and share knowledge with others, we're empowering the next generation to continue to do the same.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing some of the amazing things that you're doing, Sam, and just so excited for all that's to come there. So let's kick it off with some of the things that we are hoping to address tonight. Um, I want to be clear that we could spend all evening diving into what the current administration is doing in terms of the Department of Defense and the lives of service members, particularly recent actions by the Secretary of Defense, but we just don't have the time. And right now, we're going to really focus on some of the things that we, you know, may disagree with or things that we take issue with to have a discussion on why some of the concerns that we have and some of the directions that we would hope, the current administration would take and some changes that we would like to see from our own point of view. And something I've always been adamant about with this podcast and something I've loved about our recent conversations is that I think we can do that in a way that is not attacking a leader or attacking a current administration or a particular group of people. This is simply my own experiences and our own experiences and opinions. And, we're going to get into some of the things we disagree with, but there are often lots of things that you can find with someone you disagree with that you do agree with. And I don't disagree with everything that the current administration has taken a stance on in terms of the lives and livelihoods of service members, veterans, and families, but there are some things that are very concerning. And so, if you look at any news source, there's so many things going on right now in terms of directions that the administration and the Department of Defense have taken that are abnormal or a complete 180 from recent administrations and some of the work that's been done in recent decades, everything from the regulations on press and media in the Pentagon to some recent actions taken for counter narcotics operations, and particularly in what we'll focus on mostly today, some of the issues centered around gender issues, inclusion within the Department of Defense, and standards, stances, and attitudes that the Secretary of Defense is taking in the direction that he wants to see the organization that he's leading, the very large organization that he's leading, the direction that he wants them to go in. And so one thing that I'd like to start with, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Sam, because it's particularly up your lane and near and dear to your heart, is the dismantling of DACA. So I'd like to hand that over to you to kind of set the stage for what's going on and why it matters.
So, DACWITS, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, it has existed since, I believe, 1951, if my memory is serving me correctly, if it's not around there. It was started around the time that women were first permitted to actually serve in the armed forces in 1948. It was established to basically ensure that women, as directed by federal law, were being integrated into the armed services, looking at things like readiness, recruitment, retention, later on developing into topics such as sexual assault, sexual harassment, proper fitting equipment, things of that nature. This standing committee, Defense Advisory Committee, has existed since that time. We recently saw the Secretary of Defense announce that all the committees like this one were under review, and they were under review for several months. Now, this was not unprecedented. Secretary Austin did the same thing whenever he came in as the Secretary of Defense under the Biden administration. He paused all the defense advisory committees because they serve at the pleasure of the secretary. They are there to give recommendations on issues impacting service members and their families in the department. So the pausing of them was not unprecedented, but the later actions to dismantle Dakowitz is fairly unprecedented because it's never happened before that a secretary did not see the value in such a committee. And that's where we find ourselves now. And it was a progressive type action. First, it was we're reviewing all committees, not unprecedented. Then some months later, we saw that the current staff that was detailed to those committees were let go. One thing to remember is those people are all volunteers. So they essentially fired a bunch of volunteers. And then there was a memo leak saying, oh, Dakowitz is actually going to survive. And then a few days later, there was another memo that was published that said, no, that it's not. So this is very unprecedented because current day, there is not a defense advisory committee that I'm aware of that is advising on the issues that used to fall under the Dakowitz umbrella. This is along the same lines as seeing a lot of the women's initiatives teams that were stood up in the various services over the last 5 years also be dismantled earlier in January timeframe after the new administration came into place. So we are now in a reality where there isn't a venue or mechanism for service members to bring up issues that are impacting them, and that can be male or female, right? I've said this many times in many public forums that we had males that worked on the women's initiative team. Some of the most fierce advocates for equality are males. So right now we don't have that venue any longer for the first time in, I'm a lawyer, so I try not to do public math, but 75-ish years, somewhere around there. Very unprecedented, and it has left a lot of veterans and service members in a place where they are not really sure where they can go or what mechanisms are going to exist to address some of these topics that Dakowitz used to look at. Now, I'll be quite honest and say that, maybe the secretary has plans to roll out some other advisory committee. He's rolled out a few others. One, I think, related to Gold Star families. Perhaps there's plans to roll out some other type of war fighter advisory committee that's going to look at these issues broadly across the force because, as you know, right, proper fitting equipment not only impacts females, but it also impacts males of larger stature or smaller stature. So maybe there's going to be a more, gender neutral, as the current administration would say, or the current secretary would say, committee that's going to look at these issues. I think we're a little too early to tell, but I do think that morale did take a hit when Dakowitz was disbanded. And I'll caveat all this with, when I'm not furloughed, which I am right now, I am a federal civilian and I do work for the Department of Defense. Like you, there are many things that I agree with. There's many things that I may not completely agree with. But none of the views that I express are on behalf of the department. They're my own. And of course, I respect the chain of command, having still serving in the military and being a federal civilian. So none of this is meant to bash or throw under the bus or serve as a, Monday morning quarterback for what the department's doing. But again, I do think that it's a conversation that should be had. And if given the opportunity, I would gladly have the same conversation with the secretary himself.
Yep. I would love that. I think it'd be a good conversation. And I want to kind of point out that there's this misconception, I think, that, and I've heard it through, the current Secretary of Defense leaders within the administration and just, people in general that, a committee like Dakowitz is only for women, and that's just not true. And you hit on it that, this involves everyone. These types of committees touch things like family planning, healthcare, you know, standards across the force, workplace development, advocacy, so many things. And sometimes I think in the government, we have this, we make the mistake of thinking that because we're the government, we should only do things this way. And, something I like to do sometimes is take a step back and look at the government like a business. So, which businesses thrive for decades and generations? It's the businesses that offer continuous feedback loops from the employee to the leadership within the business. And by eliminating groups like this, we are eliminating continuous feedback loops on things that affect people's lives every single day. They affect their well being, their families, how well they do at work, their potential for promotion, their happiness, and limiting those channels for advocacy and for positive change and evaluating, hey, what are we currently doing? Is it working? Are we meeting the needs of what soldiers need right now? Because that changes from generation to generation. It's not going to look the same 20 years ago, as it did 20 years ago or 20 years in the future. And I'm all about personally shaking things up, right? Every administration should come in and say, where are we at and where do we want to be? That's the hope, right? That's the goal, is that with each new leadership cycle there is change and there is a continuous evaluation of where we're at and where we want to be. However, it feels personally that we are taking steps back in a almost archaic sense when we eliminate, you know opportunities for service members to advocate for their own needs. And I'll never forget, I had a soldier who came to me one time and was complaining about, um, pregnant soldiers that they worked with. And, it's hard to not get frustrated when people, I guess, blame women in the service for having children and doing what, we expect most women to do in society to keep society going. But there seems to be this label that can be put on women when they family plan within the military. And, I asked him, I said, how would you feel if your wife was spoken about like you are right now by her coworkers, wherever she works? I don't think his wife was a service member. And I think he made the connection that, this is something that affects the lives of men too, and all types of families and all types of people. You know, family planning is not just a women's issue. Women's health is not just a women's issue. Equipment fitting correctly and making sure that we are creating the most lethal force is not a women's issue. But communities like this help to elevate issues that maybe at times predominantly affect women, but trickle down to all corners of the military.
And I think that a great testament to that, and like when we get back to the data and what the evidence shows, since Dakowitz has existed or did exist for the roughly 70-ish years it existed, like something more than like 90% of its recommendations were adopted by the Secretary of Defense at the time that they worked for. Now, mind you, the Secretary of Defenses served in different administrations, right? Administrations, we've been led under all different types of administrations, to include Republican and Democrat, and all of those Secretary of Defenses, 9 times out of 10, adopted the recommendations of this committee. And I think that speaks volumes of the value that it brought to the service. Another point that I think speaks volumes to how important it was, the people who served on these committees were retired service members or folks otherwise affiliated with the defense sector. that volunteered their time to further the mission and vision of the committee for 70-ish years. To me, that I just think the proof is in the pudding. Unfortunately, we didn't really get much of a explanation as to why it was dismantled. I think we got a couple one-liners, as we did similar to the Women, Peace, and Security announcement or dismantling of that program as well. And it's fascinating because one thing I have asked myself consistently as these new programs and policies have been rolling out or being disbanded is, what does the data say? Right now, there's a huge emphasis on physical fitness. I will be the first to tell you, and I know you would too, like, physical fitness is important. It is part of our job when you serve in the military. Anybody who serves knows that, for the most part. And my first question with the rollout of some of these new physical fitness standards, or what we're calling gender neutral fitness standards for combat arms, is where's the data that says that our system we were using is broken? No one that I've seen publicly has pointed out that, well, the Air Force's test wasn't working because, or the Marine Corps test wasn't working because. I go back to the question of, what does the data say? How was it broken? Oh, and if we don't have that, then in my mind, as a logical human being, I ask the question of, well, then are we just doing change for change's sake? Because we shouldn't be doing change for change's sake. The change and the progress that we are making in the name of lethality should be data backed. And you've heard the current leadership in the department speak about data-backed decisions ad nauseum. They're all about data and making decisions based on data, but that's one thing, at least for me, I haven't seen, is where's the data to say that the programs and processes that were already in place weren't working, outside of comments about standards being lowered in 2015, which I've also looked into that and done my own research, as I think anyone should. I've not been able to find where standards were lowered in combat arms when the combat exclusion ban was lifted. And I also haven't been able to find where any of those combat arms jobs has gender-based standards. They already have gender-neutral standards.
Right. Yeah. And I think that you brought up an excellent point that anybody who has served in government or in the military in this case knows how frustrating it is when change is made for change's sake. It is the most frustrating thing year to year to have a different standard that you're training your soldiers, airmen, sailors, Marines, whatever, to, and having to constantly adapt without understanding why we're even ripping the carpet out from underneath them. And when these big changes are made, it takes years to adapt. And, one of the comments that was recently made by the Secretary of Defense that I found really alarming was that, we were going to start holding females to the male standard. And it was a line that caught a lot of attention, and I think rightfully so, aggravated a lot of women in particular, because many women have been training to at or above the maximum standard for a large portion of their career. Most women I know believe in a occupation-based physical fitness test that trains to the standards of the job. And, we have since 2013 seen women do things like go to Ranger School, go through Special Forces selection, do things that were previously not allowed in terms of breaking the standard. And, I think there are two camps and two trains of thought with comments like this and stances that leaders take. I think there are people who are outraged when these things happen. And then I think there are people who say, oh, well, they're just saying that to rustle feathers, or they're just saying that, to get a rise out of people, or it doesn't really matter. They're just making those comments, but it'll blow over. And My 2 cents and um, my opinion is that it does matter because this is someone and these are people who are leading one of the largest organizations in our country and affecting just millions of people with the things that they say or don't say and the stances that they take or do not take. And I think of this in two separate lights. One, you are dividing your current force into an us versus them with comments like this. And this is my opinion, but we have worked for decades to do the exact opposite, to create unity in our force. We both wear the same uniform. We have different backgrounds. We come from different places. Maybe, we're different genders, we're different races, whatever, but we put on the same uniform and we fight the same fight. And by saying things like that from the leader who's leading this organization and implying that, you know, women have been falling behind or they haven't been held accountable, or, saying things like, we've been working towards woke ideologies and we're dismantling these woke programs, it feels like we are politicizing our force. And then the second concern I have and stance I take on this, an issue I have, is that you know, my some of my biggest fears in terms of our future and the future of, you know, our kids and their kids and generations to come is creating a strong, ready, and sustainable military. You know, we we talk about all the time fighting against our adversaries, staying relevant. We can't always be America just because we're America. We have to continually grow the next generation and, instill our values and create who we want to be. And when you look at the values of the next generation, it is not what has been communicated when it comes to these issues that we're talking about right here. I work in my civilian capacity in human resources, and I'm always doing research and thinking about and talking about what matters to the younger generation because that's who we're recruiting, that's who we're building our teams with. And if I want to stay relevant and my organization wants to stay relevant, I have to know that. And it doesn't matter what Sarah or my employer or my boss believes. We gotta meet people where they're at. We gotta understand and we have to change and adapt to the needs and the values of the next generation. And I'll tell you what, they value inclusivity. They value having a voice. They value respecting one another. And I think that creating this divide, you're creating a divide in that next generation. And I worry about the effects that that has on recruitment, on retention, on the interest and the desire to serve and attracting the best and brightest to grow the next generations of our military. And so, I've heard people say, and I continue to hear people say, oh, it doesn't matter, they're just words, but they're stances. I mean, we had the Secretary of Defense gather a large number of general officers recently in the Virginia area to basically say, this is what we're doing. These are the stances that we're taking. And, his comments were, in my opinion, aggressive in nature and, in my opinion, divisive. And, it's quite frankly, nothing I've ever seen before in my lifetime. And I don't know that we've ever really had such an aggressive, hard line, hey, we're pulling back and we're doing this. So it made, the administration has made a statement on what they believe and, what their priorities are. But my concern is, how this affects generations to come, how it trickles down to the formations that currently exist in the military. And when you look at some of the safety issues of service members and their well-being, things like building cohesive teams, eliminating the likelihood of workplace harassment, sexual harassment, and assault. When you create divisiveness and us versus them and break that trust, you know, risk factors go up, and we have data to support that through lots of different sources of, why that is. And so that's something that really concerns me.
I think you make a lot of really great points, and I was taking down some notes. So Sam Sliney's opinion, I think that, like we both have kind of indicated, there are good things and there are bad things that are happening. I don't disagree when the secretary says unity is our greatest strength. To your point, I have always embraced service. I joined the military for that unity. When I left active duty, joined the Air National Guard because I still wanted that unity. I wanted to be a part of that team. But I think we have a messaging, there may be a messaging problem, or I won't say a messaging problem. I would say I believe that there's a better way to message some of the stuff that's being announced. You use the term to describe it, as aggressive. I think that to the younger generation, there is a better way to message it in not such a manner. Now, I contrast that with, right, publicly there have been a lot of statements about all the services meeting their recruitment numbers for this recruiting year. They all met their numbers. I would ask, do we believe that is in part because of the current administration's recruiting efforts, or is that a result of recruiting efforts that have happened over the last couple of years? And I don't know, right? I get back to, like, we have to look at the data and what that says. The other question is, we can't just look at recruitment in a vacuum, right? We have to look at retention, because we just can't have a bunch of brand new privates and E1s and O1s coming into the force, right? You have to have the more senior leaders there to teach them, to mentor them, to make them into the leaders that they need to be for the next generation. That's just how our training pipeline works. And then, to your point, we cannot be short-sighted in understanding that our greatest competitor, I've heard them called competitor, I've heard them called, some people say enemy. I think I like the competitor term. When we start thinking about great power competition in China, the idea that everyone across the services should all look and be the same, meet the same fitness, high fitness male standard, I think that is going to have a negative impact in a lot of our career fields, where what you bring to the fight as an individual necessarily isn't your brute strength, right? Your intelligence officers, your cyber warfare officers, your cyber operators. These are folks that we already have difficulty recruiting and especially retaining whenever they can get out after a 4-year commitment and join the private sector and make way more money. But we need them. These are the, when we talk the full spectrum of warfare domains, air, land, sea, cyber, space, these are going to be critical components to competing with our near-peer adversaries, to include China. And there, at least my opinion and what I'm seeing, is a very narrow look at what it means to be a soldier, what a soldier, quote unquote, looks like, or what an airman, quote unquote, looks like. And I would hope that the decisions that are being made at the top are data driven and data is being looked at, and that they are also considering these other factors when we're talking the generation that's coming behind us, and the impact that some of these things are going to have on retention. And then, yes, recruiting is great now, but in a year from now, is that still going to be the same? Because, yeah, we met our recruiting numbers, but a lot of these new policies have just been published over the last couple of months. So I don't think we've yet to see the impact that those might have on recruitment. As far as, it's another interesting, again, kind of marketing or public relations messaging campaign, right? This idea that, women, we're not going to support family planning, or we're going to ignore everything about a female that makes her a female. is you also see messaging from the current administration emphasizing the drop in the United States birth rate and incentivizing women to have children. And so you have that coming from the top, but then this seemingly other messaging coming that says quite the opposite. And, you know, maybe the whole point of that is, hey, women don't belong in the military and we think you should be at home having babies. I don't know if that's the messaging that they're intending. It's certainly one that could be drawn from those messages. I just think there's a lot to be said for how some of the messaging is coming out to the force and how it's being received by the force, all the way from the general officers who were in that room when the speech happened, all the way down to the brand new E1 that may be in, you know, basic military training.
Right, exactly. And I think that, going back to it's not all bad. So I never want this podcast to be oh my gosh, the world is burning, because it feels like every news cycle and news source these days makes it seem that way. There are a lot of things that the Secretary of Defense has brought up that I do agree with. One of the things is um, eliminating some of the quote unquote unnecessary training and approval cycles for certain things that are wasting time and taking time away from the things that matter most, like readiness, like training, actually doing our jobs. And when you look at risk factors within a formation, overburdening troops and overburdening leaders to have a completely unrealistic number of tasks and priorities and things that they have to focus on in the calendar year, increase risk factors for things that promote unsafe behavior within formations, to include fatalities, DUIs, harassment, assault, and just overall weakening the morale within the formation. And so I agree with, so many of the stances that this leadership has taken on getting back to the basics, quote unquote, is one of the things that they've emphasized over and over again. But to insinuate that in order to get back to the basics and in order to do our jobs and be lethal and be effective and efficient at what we're doing, we have to get rid of these other initiatives and other priorities like inclusivity, safety, giving people a voice, allowing people to advocate for their needs and the needs of the service members that they're leading, is just, quite frankly, in my opinion, not true and quite a shame. And, again, going back to the danger of doing some of the things that we're talking about, when you think about the years and the decades that it's take to make positive change, right? To look at what our parental leave policy is, to look at some of the restrictions we have around family planning, to look at gender inclusivity in combat arms jobs, to look at, how certain, things surrounding gender family planning affect promotion or affect career advancement, to walk that back and to not allow for the continuous improvement of those things. It's taken decades to build, and I don't know how many decades it will take to rebuild if, a new administration comes in and tries to implement it all over again. And so for each step back, it feels like it will take 5 steps forward, in my opinion, to get us back to where we should be, which is always getting better. And it doesn't have to be a this or that. You know, one thing that, again, the Secretary of Defense has emphasized over and over again is going back to the warrior ethos. And the warrior ethos mentality in my time of service had nothing to do with, not making things equitable or not promoting the well-being and advancement of everybody within the formation and giving people a voice. It just meant that we were doing our jobs and we were doing what we were called to do and what we swore we would do as service members.
Yeah, the idea of like the warrior ethos and the other tenets or priorities he's laid out, again, they very much, leadership has pushed this whole transparency. Oh, we're going to be transparent. You've seen videos posted on X, not only for DoD leadership, but leadership in other federal agencies like the VA. If I had to make a recommendation, put my tip in the tip jar that sits outside of the secretary's office, one of the things I would say is, you promise transparency, but giving one-liners here and there, your force wants more. If there's not enough room at the table for all of these things, why is that? What data have you and your team looked at that has shown that these other things were a distraction, or that these things weren't effective? Going back to Dakowitz, right? We know 9 out of 10 of their recommendations were accepted by any other Secretary of Defense. So they had a very successful history and foundation that it was built on. What did you take out of the data that led you to decide that these things were no longer value added, or that there's not enough time or space to prioritize these things? Again, I like to start from, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt and giving the emphasis on data and transparency. I think it would help the force at all levels understand the decision making if it was explained in those terms. Well, what was wrong with the physical fitness standards? Going to the shaving, what made it so wrong for someone to have a shaving waiver if they have a medical condition that literally makes it painful for them to shave? I compare that to when a woman is postpartum or pregnant, right? We have a pregnancy profile because it's not safe for us to do certain things because it will harm the person. I see the shaving. I mean, that's the whole reason why we have medical profiles. So there's been these decisions and this promise of transparency. And if I had to make a recommendation, to current DoD leadership, it would be, what is the data that's underpinning your decision-making process? Like, what is the big picture here? Where are we going with all this? And at the end of the day, how is this helping us to compete with China? How is this helping us to recruit and retain those intelligence officers, cyber warfare officers? The full gamut of AFSCs, MOSs, and rates to fight China, right? To go to war with China. And I don't think for me at least, and I'm only speaking for Sam Sliney, I haven't seen those dots connected. I hope that they can be connected, and I trust, because as I've said before, I trust in our system of government. I trust in the people who are appointed above us to make decisions. I believe in that whole process, and so I trust that decision making has happened. I think it would be beneficial for everyone to have that information shared so that we can piece those dots together, right? Because that is, for me, what I'm not seeing. And I'm obviously, I'm speaking as someone who's still serving, and there's been a lot of emphasis on people feeling free to share their opinions. Some might say that, me coming on this podcast and talking about these things puts me at risk. And maybe it does, but I feel very strongly that it's not about critiquing or undermining or challenging the authority of the secretary. I very much respect him and all the people that serve, in between him, that have been politically appointed to serve and make decisions. My one recommendation would be, share with us the information to help us piece the dots together. And maybe that's forthcoming, right? Because they are working on the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. So maybe those documents, once they're published, they will kind of piece those dots together. I don't know, because I haven't seen them yet. But that for me is, I think that is what is leading towards a lot of people's general concern about some of the things that are going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, oftentimes when, on the podcast, we've talked about directions that an administration has taken, or things that are right or wrong with government. It comes down to leadership. And anyone who's ever held a job, whether you're serving, your government or working in a restaurant, that the best leaders are the ones who can unify the group and listen, act, and empower and inspire, right? So we want our elected officials or our leaders in our organizations to be representations of who we are and advocates for us, right? And obviously there's always a time and place for a leader to make a decision or take things in a direction that, maybe not everybody agrees with, or maybe there's a large chunk of people who aren't convinced, but the hope is that it is effectively communicated the why behind drastic changes that affect the livelihood, the culture, the effectiveness, and the future of an organization. And so I think that's really what we're wanting right now, and what you and I are getting at is what's the why? How does this connect back to the things that we've highlighted as our priorities, which are being more effective, being more lethal, out surviving and out thriving our competition, constantly evolving our force, like you said, to attract top talent. We're not fighting in a World War One, World War Two, Vietnam era world. We are fighting in today's world, which is, you look at any of the current conflicts going on in any parts of the world, it is advanced and is not, troops on the ground going into battle, and, we're keeping our, women at, support, roles or behind the main effort. We have all sorts of people and all sorts of folks at all levels of the organization doing a variety of jobs, ranging from, regular infantry, traditional style warfare, to cyber, to, drones, to, information warfare, to, in different types of intelligence capabilities, signal, what have you. And we need to be representing all of those folks and also creating a force that attracts and retains the talent that we need in order to succeed and to win.
Yeah, the interesting thing about like our 4-year cycle of administrations changing out our presidential elections, right, is it's really hard to experience the fruits of your own labor, right? Like that's one of the critiques I've always had about command in the Air Force, is it generally is 2 years. You can't really make any institutional change or culture change in 2 years. It's not enough time to do that. And so really, we won't see after this administration, right? And we have the next presidential election, and potentially somebody new coming in, potentially not. We may not see the fruits of what's happening right now until years down the road. So again, I just hope that the big picture is being considered, that we're not just operating in a I'm in your face here right now mentality, that we are truly thinking, as you've pointed out as an HR professional, what is, I don't even know what we're on, Gen Alpha now or Gen Bravo, like we've already went through the alphabet or something.
It's so hard to keep up
So
with.
like, what are they, how are we going to be recruiting them? And also our current service members and their family members are the military's biggest recruitment tool, right? We know as of right now when we're recording this, we're in a government shutdown. Is that impacting how military families and service members are going to tell the next generation? Are they going to tell them to serve? Like, yes, you should serve because it's quote unquote a stable job, whenever we just spent the last couple of weeks stressing about whether we're going to get paychecks or not, right? We're going to be looking at that again here in the next couple of weeks, because while the president was able to use allegedly his general transfer authority to pay for the last pay period for the military, under that same authority, many legal scholars would tell you that he's exercised that authority and doesn't have the ability to do it again. So I think all these things are compounding on really, our biggest recruitment tool are service members and their families, and are those people going to recommend service to the next generation? And that, honestly, the fascinating thing about that is it comes full circle, because Secretary Hegseth, in his speech, that was his go-to, was, are you serving in the unit that you would want your son or daughter to serve in? And,
Yeah.
I think the answer to that will depend on who you're talking to, but I think it's a very interesting question to pose to the force as the secretary. I actually think it's a really great question to ask. As a mother, obviously, I'm a little bit biased. I'm always asking myself that, but I'm not so certain that I'm just not sure where the messaging is going to land and whether the answer to that question is going to be positive in nature.
Right. Well, I hope it is. And, one thing that you said that I believe and I truly wholeheartedly continue to believe, despite the circumstances, is I do believe in our government. I believe in the American people, and I most certainly believe in the veteran population, which is why after active duty, I've chosen to stay connected through platforms like this and through different means of advocacy because I think that we are an unstoppable force. And so my hope is that these conversations continue to happen and they're not just happening on podcasts or in news publications, but they're happening with the levels of leadership that can change and can affect the direction that things are going in. But Sam, I know that we are close to bedtime, so I really want to thank you for your time tonight and kicking off our new initiative together, addressing roughly monthly when we can some of the most pressing issues for the veteran community and the listeners of our podcast, discussing what's going on, our thoughts on some of the events taking place, and calls to action, and not just adding to the doom news cycle, but creating a positive spin and positive progress on the topics we discuss.
Absolutely, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to step into the arena with you and have these conversations. And I'm just very grateful that you offered up this opportunity to me. And I look forward to our future conversations.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Until next time.
The Women in the Arena podcast is powered by Iron Butterfly Media, a production company committed to honoring the lives of women who have had an unseen and outsized impact on our world. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you have a woman who you would like to nominate as a guest, please shoot us a message on our social media platforms. Be sure to subscribe and follow on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. See you next time.